This happened many years ago in a chapter of my life that feels increasingly like a fever dream, though the sensory details remain sharp and jagged. I've never liked camping. I'm simply not built for the ordeal. There is a specific kind of misery found in the grit of dirt that gets under your fingernails, the relentless hum of insects seeking heat, and those interminable, uncomfortable nights spent in a sleeping bag. No matter how much padding you think you have, by 3 a.m., the ground always manages to find your hip bone, turning the earth into a cold, unforgiving rock. Unfortunately, despite my biological aversion to the wilderness, I have been camping more times than I can count. These excursions were never by choice. My father is one of those rugged, wilderness-loving types, a man who views a lack of electricity as a spiritual cleanse. Every summer during my childhood, like a ritualistic sentence, he dragged me out into the deep woods alongside his equally rugged friends. Their mission was always the same: to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. For them, it was a pilgrimage. For me, it was a hostage situation. By the time I hit my sophomore year of high school, the silent resentment I'd carried for years finally reached a breaking point. I had had enough of suffering in a vacuum of boredom. I pleaded with my father, mounting a campaign of persuasion until he finally agreed to let me bring a friend along. I argued that it would make the whole ordeal a little more bearable, and to my genuine surprise, he agreed without the usual fuss about manly solitude. So I brought Charles. On paper, Charles should have made the experience worse. He was a hardcore Boy Scout back in the day, a teenager who actually derived joy from navigating by the stars and identifying moss. But Charles was cool. He teased me relentlessly for my hatred of the brush, but he wasn't one of those toxic, "you're not a real man if you don't love the outdoors" types. My logic was pragmatic. If I had to suffer, I might as well suffer with someone who knew how to start a fire without a blowtorch or pitch a tent without it collapsing into a heap of nylon and shame. Charles was stoked to come. Part of it was his genuine love for the woods, but mostly he was looking for any excuse to escape the suffocating atmosphere of his parents' house. The trip, however, was cursed from the moment we pulled out of the driveway. As it turned out, one of my dad's friends, a man whose outdoorsy confidence far outweighed his organizational skills, had catastrophically messed up the campsite booking. Instead of the remote, peaceful sanctuary deep in the timber that my father craved, we pulled into a crappy, overdeveloped tourist trap. I'm talking about indoor bathrooms with flickering fluorescent lights, paved walkways that smelled of hot asphalt, and even a primary colored playground for toddlers. It wasn't camping. It was basically glorified backyard living. Glamping, I suppose, though even that felt too sophisticated a word for this place. To say my father was upset would be a massive understatement. He radiated a quiet, vibrating fury as he looked at the vending machines near the check-in booth. But we didn't even discover the true depth of the disaster until a few hours later. Situated directly adjacent to the campsite, separated only by a chain-link fence and a thin veil of trees, was a mini amusement park. I'm not joking. An actual amusement park sat right there, complete with peeling paint on carnival games, the skeletal structure of a Ferris wheel, and a handful of rusted roller coasters. The sight was surreal. These two settings, the primal woods and the neon-lit artificiality of an amusement park, were never supposed to collide. The juxtaposition felt wrong, like a glitch in reality. Everyone in our party was pissed. My dad and his friends huddled together, grumbling into their beer cans about how this wasn't real camping, their dreams of rugged isolation dying under the distant sound of a tilt-a-whirl test run. Charles wouldn't shut up about it either. "This isn't real camping," he kept saying, his voice thick with the smugness of an Eagle Scout. He said it over and over, as if I needed the constant reminder of our failure. It started getting genuinely annoying. Charles began making these pointed jokes about my family, implying we didn't even know what the wilderness was. Now, as much as I hate camping, I know what the ritual is supposed to look like. I grew up in the shadow of my father's flannel shirts. I was getting defensive, my nerves frayed by the heat and the irony of our location. I eventually told him to knock it off, my voice sharper than intended. He caught the vibe and finally went quiet, but the atmosphere remained heavy and sour. The situation was objectively terrible. We had driven hours to get there. It wasn't like we could just turn around and go home. So, with no better option and the sun beginning to dip, we made the best of a bad situation. The grown-ups sulked for a while, nursing their bruised egos, but eventually the mechanical habit of the outdoors took over and they got to work setting up the site. This was Charles's moment to shine. He moved with a practiced, annoying efficiency. Within minutes, he had our tent upright. Every knot was tied with nautical precision. The rain fly was pulled taut, the stakes driven deep and secure. The whole structure looked like it had been lifted directly out of an instructional manual. Even my dad, a man who never offered a compliment unless someone was actively bleeding or unconscious, looked at the tent and gave a short, begrudging nod of approval. That nod got under my skin, a tiny needle of sibling-like rivalry. Charles and I were sharing the tent, and once the gear was stowed and a mediocre dinner was consumed, we slipped away under the flimsy excuse of organizing our sleeping arrangements. The truth was more illicit. Charles had brought a small metal pipe and a modest stash of weed tucked away in an old, dented Altoids tin. It wasn't anything heavy, just enough to take the sharp edge off the frustration of the day. Looking back, I should mention that Charles and I were firmly in that delinquent phase of adolescence. We were the kids who liked causing minor trouble, lingering in places we didn't belong, and testing the boundaries of the adult world. I don't smoke anymore, and a part of me will always wonder if the only reason I did back then was a desperate attempt to stick out and defy the norms I felt trapped by. The two of us snuck past the perimeter of the light and into the shadows of the nearby trees. We smoked, whispering and chuckling to ourselves, the smoke curling up into the canopy. Neither of us was worried about the smell. We figured we'd be avoiding the adults for the rest of the night anyway, and the woods have a way of swallowing scents. We finished the session and drifted back to the tent, our minds hazy and our bodies humming with a nervous, artificial energy. After a few hours of lying in the dark, talking in low tones about school and friends and the general absurdity of our lives, we both realized we were far too wired to sleep. The silence of the woods felt too loud. Charles turned his head toward me, a slow, mischievous grin spreading across his face in the dark. I could practically see the gears turning. He leaned in and suggested we go explore the campsite. I was skeptical at first. What was there to see? A playground? A bathroom? But then I realized he wasn't looking at the campsite. He was looking toward the fence. He meant the amusement park. The idea piqued my interest instantly. The weed had granted me a false sense of bravado, and the thought of breaking into a closed park was far more appealing than lying on the hard ground. Charles whispered that it would be a piece of cake to get to the top of one of those roller coasters. Climbing things, abandoned buildings, water towers, construction cranes, was something we loved doing back then. The thought of standing atop a roller coaster in the dead of night was exhilarating. We waited until we were absolutely certain the adults were in a deep, beer-induced sleep. Then, we made our move. It was well after midnight, the air cool and still. We grabbed our flashlights, tucked them into our pockets, and crept toward the high chain-link fence that marked the park's boundary. Getting in was deceptively easy. A little boost from Charles, a quick scramble over the cold metal wire, and we dropped onto the asphalt on the other side. The park was a skeleton of its daytime self. Everything was dark, but it wasn't empty. We quickly realized there were security guards on duty. Every so often, the low, electric hum of a golf cart would drift through the air, accompanied by the sweeping arc of a headlight. It felt like being inside a stealth video game. We moved through the park in fits and starts, our hearts hammering against our ribs. We ducked behind colorful plywood buildings, hid in the shadows of closed popcorn stands, and kept our eyes peeled for the patrols. At one point, we had to hold our breath as we sprinted across a long, open stretch of paved road to avoid a passing guard. It was thrilling, but it was also scary as hell. It's a difficult feeling to describe, that teenage cocktail of invincibility and the looming dread of consequence. We knew if we were caught, the fallout would be catastrophic. Finally, we reached the base of the main roller coaster. Up close, the thing was a monster. It looked significantly larger and more imposing than it had from the safety of the fire pit. We circled the wooden and metal lattice until we spotted the maintenance stairs running alongside the initial steep ascent. Without hesitating, we started to climb. The metal rungs clanged softly under our sneakers, a sound that felt like thunder in the silence of the park. We moved one step at a time, gripping the cold rails. For a significant stretch of the climb, there were no railings at all, just the narrow stairs and the yawning drop into the darkness below. It was terrifying, the wind whistling through the girders. We finally reached the summit. The view was unreal. From that height, we could see the entire sleeping park laid out like a toy set, and beyond that, the dark, undulating ocean of the forest. We took a single photo up there, a grainy, dark testament to our climb. I wish we had taken more, but the fear of being spotted was too great. We were silhouettes against the sky. If a guard looked up, we were finished. We wouldn't be able to get down in time to run. We should go, I whispered, the adrenaline beginning to sour into a need for safety. We descended quickly, our knees shaking slightly. Once our feet hit the ground, we started creeping back toward the fence, retracing our steps through the labyrinth of rides. For some reason, the return trip felt much faster. Maybe it was the urgency, or maybe the patrol frequency had dipped in the early morning hours. We were maybe 5 minutes from the spot where we'd hopped the fence when we had to freeze. The low hum of a golf cart returned, and the flash of a headlight cut through the dark. We quickly ducked behind a small, shuttered snack shack, pressing our backs against the cold wood. That's when I noticed it. Something moved in the darkness between two buildings about 30 feet away. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the guard's cart. But then Charles's hand gripped my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. He pointed silently in the same direction. I focused my gaze, my breathing shallow. There was a person. They were crouching down, tucked into the shadows, just like we were, seemingly trying to avoid the guards. My first thought was that it was another kid, but as the figure shifted, I realized the proportions were all wrong. This was a man. And the worst part, the part that made the hair on my neck stand up, was the realization that he was looking directly at us. He wasn't looking at the guards. He was watching us. We were frozen. We couldn't run because the guard was still too close, his cart idling nearby. I kept my eyes glued to the figure. Suddenly, the man moved. He darted across a small patch of open ground, passing directly through the dim spill of light from a nearby street lamp. In that split second, I saw him with horrifying clarity. He was disheveled, wearing tattered, filthy clothing. He moved with an awkward, hitching stride, as if he were injured or somehow physically disfigured. But the detail that burned itself into my memory was his face. A dark, thick liquid was smeared across his skin and clothes. In the yellow light of the lamp, it looked like blood. Charles saw it too. We exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The man vanished back into the shadows between the buildings. Finally, the guard's cart moved on, the sound fading into the distance. We didn't wait. We moved with a frantic, silent desperation back toward the fence. I kept checking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced I would see that blood-smeared face emerging from the darkness behind us, but the shadows remained still. We reached the fence, scaled it with a frantic energy we hadn't had before, and dropped onto the campsite side. This time, we didn't laugh. There was no sense of triumph. All I wanted was to be back in the thin, fragile safety of our tent. I could tell Charles felt the same. His face was pale, his eyes wide. When we crawled back into our sleeping bags, neither of us even mentioned sleep. We just lay there in the dark, staring at the nylon ceiling, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a homeless guy who'd had a rough night. It was a stupid, hollow explanation, but we clung to it because the alternative was too dark to contemplate. The next morning started with a deceptive normalcy. We got up, the sun was shining, and we began the mundane task of packing our gear for a fishing trip. But around 10 a.m., the atmosphere of the entire campground shifted. A park staffer began making rounds, moving from site to site with a grim expression. When he reached us, he delivered an announcement that chilled the marrow of my bones. A man had been found stabbed to death the night before at a lake about 4 miles away. The details were sparse, but the killer was still at large. The local sheriff's office had placed all rangers and staff within the radius on high alert. The description hit us like a physical blow. A disheveled male, late 30s, possibly shirtless, and likely covered in blood. They told us to pack our things and leave immediately for our own safety. Charles, and I didn't need to speak. We instantly connected the dots. The man in the shadows, the one watching us from 30 feet away, was a murderer on the run. We kept our mouths shut. We didn't tell my dad. We didn't tell the Rangers. And to this day, I struggle to explain why. I know people will judge us for that. I get it. But at 16, the fear of getting in trouble for breaking into the park and smoking weed outweighed our civic duty. I was terrified that if I spoke up, the first question would be, "What were you doing in the amusement park at 2 a.m.?" I still kick myself for that silence. My statement could have helped catch a monster. I'm still close with Charles. We went to the same college, graduated together, and work in the same field, but we almost never talk about that night. I think Charles carries more guilt about it than I do. I see it in his eyes whenever the subject of camping comes up. It haunts me to think how close we were. We were mere feet away from a man who had just taken a life. I try not to imagine what would have happened if our paths had crossed more directly in those dark aisles of the park. That wasn't the only time my life felt like a horror movie. Fast forward to October 2016. It was the height of that bizarre clown hysteria that was dominating the news cycles. People were posting sightings of creepy clowns in woods and parking lots across the country. Most were hoaxes, but the fear was real. I was 16 then, a junior in high school. I just finished my 7th period class, and after the usual hallway goodbyes, I hopped on the Uptown 6 train. The car was unusually empty for that time of day, but I didn't think much of it. I was in my own world, headphones in, blasting music, probably Drake if I'm being honest, and staring at chemistry flashcards on my phone. I was as unaware of my surroundings as a human being could possibly be. I was planning to get off at 96th Street and walk home. It was a routine I performed hundreds of times. It was muscle memory. When the train pulled into 96th, I stood up instinctively, barely looking away from my screen. As the door slid open, I moved to step out, but something blocked my path. I looked up, expecting a slow commuter, but instead, I found myself staring into the painted face of a clown. He was in full costume, oversized rainbow pants, a baggy yellow shirt held up by red suspenders, and those ridiculous giant red shoes. His face was a mask of thick, smeared white grease paint, with blue eyebrows and a bulbous red nose. He didn't have a wig, which somehow made the look even more unsettling, just the raw, painted face. I froze. He wasn't trying to get on the train. He was just standing there, filling the doorway, preventing me from leaving. I had maybe 5 seconds before the doors would close and trap me with him, or leave me stranded. I tried to brush past him, but the moment I made contact, he leaned down in a fluid, predatory motion, bringing his face inches from mine. Before he could grab me, I found a burst of adrenaline and sprinted past him onto the platform. I heard the heavy thud of his shoes as he lurched forward, trying to tackle me. I dodged, my heart screaming, and I just ran. I looked back once. He was pursuing me with a terrifying, jerky stride, his limbs moving like they were out of proportion. And in his hand, he held a long kitchen knife. The 96th Street station was empty. I scrambled up the stairs and burst out onto the street, where the light of day felt like a shield. I reported it to the police immediately. They sent someone down, but of course he was gone. For weeks, I lived in a state of irrational paranoia, convinced he had followed me home, that he was waiting in the shadows of my apartment building. Eventually, the fear faded, but the image of that painted face leaning into mine never truly left. Then there was the hotel. This was 2 years after I finished undergrad. I was in a transitional phase, taking online graduate courses and looking for any odd job to keep my bank account from hitting zero. I spent my nights on Indeed, scrolling through the digital abyss of minimum wage labor. I found a listing for a private lifeguard at a hotel a few towns over. It seemed normal at first glance, but the details were off. The hours were inverted, 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. a night shift for a swimming pool. More bizarrely, the listing explicitly stated they wanted someone who did not speak Spanish. I'm half Mexican. I've spoken Spanish since I was a toddler, and the town where the hotel was located was almost entirely Spanish-speaking. The requirement made no sense, but the pay was $30 an hour, which, back then, felt like winning the lottery. I decided to lie. I figured I'd just pretend to be a monolingual American and pocket the cash. On my first day, I was met by a friendly, stout man named Esteban. He was welcoming and funny, which put me at ease. But then, a taller man, who I later knew as Heath, turned the corner. He didn't smile. He walked straight up to me and began speaking rapidly in Spanish, watching my face for any flicker of understanding. I gave him the blankiest, most vacant stare I could muster. After a few tense seconds, they both burst out laughing, claiming it was just a test or a joke. Heath shook my hand and explained the job. They were opening the pool to non-guests to increase revenue. He said they wanted a non-Spanish speaker so I wouldn't get harassed by rowdy locals. Then came the kicker. Heath told me that if anyone showed me a blue wristband, I was to let them into the pool house, a large, windowless building behind my stand. The first month was quiet. I collected money, watched the water, and kept my mouth shut. Then, the wristbands started appearing. It started with a buff man in shades who didn't speak a word of English. He showed the band. I unlocked the door. An hour later, he left, his backpack looking much heavier than when he arrived. Soon, it was a parade of wristbands. Groups of men would go into that building and stay for hours. I also noticed I was being overpaid, constantly. People would hand me $50 bills for a $10 entry and tell me to keep the change. When I called Heath to mention the mistakes, he told me to shut up and hang up the phone. That was the moment I knew. Money laundering, drug trafficking. Something dark was happening behind that locked door, and I was the clueless face of the operation. I should have quit, but the money was addictive. I was making more in tips than in wages. One afternoon, I saved a kid from drowning. It wasn't a big deal, just a kid who went too deep, but the reaction was massive. The patrons gave me a standing ovation. Heath even came down to thank me personally. It turned out the kid was his son. The next day, a group of them met me at the gate with wine to celebrate. They made a toast. One man spoke in Spanish, not knowing I understood every word. He toasted to the lives they were destroying and the fortune they were building. They laughed. I drank the wine, but it tasted like ash. I realized then that I was part of something truly insidious. The end came the following day. My mother called me. She only spoke Spanish, and it was an emergency. I stepped into what I thought was a private alcove and answered her in our native tongue. When I hung up and turned around, Esteban was standing there. The friendly mask was gone. His face was cold, his eyes hard. "How long have you known Spanish?" he asked. I tried to play it off, saying I was just practicing, but we both knew the lie was dead. He stared at me for a long time, as if weighing the cost of my life against the inconvenience of my knowledge. My heart was a drum in my chest. I felt like I was looking at my own grave. "Okay," he finally said, and walked away. I went back to my stand, frozen in terror. I couldn't even force myself to leave. I was afraid that running would be seen as a confession of guilt. Before my shift ended, Heath approached me. He told me to come in an hour early the next day because he had a new opportunity for me. He handed me a $200 tip and walked into the hotel. I walked to my car, drove home, and never went back. I blocked their numbers and spent months in a state of total panic, watching every van that drove down my street. I still don't fully understand why they needed me. Maybe just a legal face for the business in case the cops showed up. I'm convinced I was close to death that day. The way Esteban looked at me, there was only one thing on his mind, and it wasn't a promotion.